Dr. Edward Hartford stood deep within the jungle of a moon that had no name. His boots pressed into soil that was wet and dark from endless rain. Around him, the trees grew so tall that sunlight barely reached the ground. Strange creatures moved through the branches above, their calls echoing through the thick air. Edward's breathing was heavy inside his helmet as he walked forward, checking his scanner every few seconds. Edward had come to this moon to study plants and rocks. He was a scientist who loved mysteries. For 10 years, he had traveled to different worlds, always searching for something unusual, something that would change the way people thought about the universe. He had found interesting fossils and rare minerals, but nothing truly remarkable. Nothing that would make him famous or make his work matter to the whole world. Today might be different. The scanner in his hand started making strange sounds. Edward stopped walking and looked at the device carefully. It was showing readings that made no sense. The numbers jumped up and down wildly, pointing in one direction deeper into the jungle. Edward had never seen his equipment act this way before. He wiped the sweat from his face and moved toward the source of the signal, pushing branches out of his way as he went. Then he saw it. At first, Edward thought it was a mountain. But as he stepped closer, he realized it was far too smooth and perfect to be natural. Rising through the jungle canopy like a giant finger pointing at the sky was a massive structure made of dark metal. It was black like the space between stars, and nothing grew on its surface. Not a single vine or moss spot covered it. After all these centuries hidden in the jungle, this thing remained perfect and untouched. Edward's heart began to pound in his chest. He moved forward slowly, his scanner now screaming with activity. The structure was enormous. He estimated it was at least 500 meters tall, maybe more. Around its base, bioluminescent vines glowed with soft blue and purple light, creating patterns that looked almost like writing or symbols. Edward had never seen plants that glowed like this before. They seemed to respond to his presence, growing brighter as he approached. He reached out his hand toward the nearest panel on the metal surface. It was smooth and cold, covered in strange markings that looked like letters from a language he had never seen. The moment his shadow touched the metal, everything changed. The entire structure erupted with brilliant light. Symbols blazed across the surface like lightning, racing from top to bottom in waves of blue, violet, and white. Edward jumped backward, his hand raised to shield his eyes from the brightness. He expected an explosion or an attack, but instead something else happened. The structure began to hum. The sound started low and deep, vibrating through the earth beneath Edward's feet. He could feel it in his bones, in his teeth, in his entire body. The humming grew louder and deeper, and then Edward heard something that made his mind struggle to understand what was real. Machines were waking up inside the structure. Countless machines, all powering on at the same time after sleeping for a very long time. A doorway appeared in the metal where there had been only solid surface before. It simply opened, sliding sideways with a smooth motion. Inside, golden light spilled out onto the wet jungle ground. Edward stood frozen, unable to move, unable to think clearly. His scanner was going crazy with readings, showing energy signatures that his training said should not exist. But they did exist. They were real. Edward took a step forward. Then another. His legs felt weak, but he moved toward the golden light anyway. Inside the doorway he saw a corridor that went deep into the structure. The walls were smooth and metallic, and they glowed with soft light. Along the corridor, symbols and patterns moved slowly across the surfaces, as if the walls themselves were alive and aware. Edward stepped fully inside and the air changed. It became cooler and cleaner than the humid jungle air outside. His helmet sensors adjusted automatically, showing him that the air was breathable and safe. Without thinking much about it, Edward removed his helmet. He had to see this clearly. He had to experience this with all his senses. The moment his helmet came off, holographic images appeared in the air before him. They showed creatures that looked nothing like humans. They were tall and graceful, with skin that seemed to shimmer with inner light. The images showed these beings building structures, launching ships into space, and seeding planets with technology and life. They were building worlds. They were creating futures. Then the images showed these beings disappearing. One by one they vanished, leaving behind only empty cities and silent machines. The final image showed this very ship, alone in space, being sent on a mission to a distant moon to wait for something. Wait for someone. Edward realized with a shock that he was the first human ever to stand in this place. He was the first of his kind to touch this technology. The ship had been waiting in the jungle for thousands of years, hidden under plants and vines, dormant and dreaming, until he walked close enough to wake it up. Edward's hand trembled as he reached toward one of the holographic images. The moment his fingers passed through the light, more information flooded his mind. Names appeared in his thoughts. Data. History. Warning messages. The beings who had created this ship were called the architects. They had walked among the stars and shaped worlds. And they had left something behind. Something important. Something that only a being with human courage and curiosity could understand. The ship hummed around him, waiting. Edward stood alone in a corridor of golden light, understanding that his life had changed forever in a single moment. He had discovered something that would change everything for humanity. Edward had not slept in 36 hours. His eyes felt heavy and dry, but he could not stop working. Around him, the ship's interior glowed with soft light, and holographic displays floated in the air like windows into forgotten worlds. He stood before a massive control panel, pressing symbols and trying different combinations, working by instinct and trial and error. Most attempts led nowhere. Some caused alarms to sound. But slowly, very slowly, he was learning how to speak the ship's language. On the third day of his work, Edward received a message on his communication device. It was Eleanor Vance, his research partner. She was coming to the moon. Edward had sent her an urgent beacon, but he had not expected her to arrive so quickly. Eleanor was brilliant, perhaps the smartest person Edward knew. If anyone could help him understand this ancient technology, it would be her. When Eleanor's shuttle landed in the clearing outside the ship, she ran toward the open doorway without hesitation. She did not stop to question what she was seeing or to be careful. Eleanor was like that. She trusted Edward completely, and if he said something important had happened, she believed him. She crossed the threshold and entered the golden light of the corridor, her eyes wide with wonder and disbelief. Edward rushed forward to meet her, and Eleanor threw her arms around him. She was shaking with excitement and fear mixed together. When she pulled back, she looked at him closely, studying his tired face and dirty clothes. She could see that he had been working hard on something enormous. Edward began to explain everything he had found, speaking quickly and jumping from one discovery to another. He showed Eleanor the holographic displays. He explained how the symbols worked. He demonstrated how the ship responded to his touch and his voice. Eleanor listened with complete focus, occasionally asking questions that made Edward think about what he had discovered in new ways. Together, they moved deeper into the ship, exploring chambers filled with information stored in forms they had never seen before. In one chamber they found records of the architects themselves. The holographic images showed their history stretching back thousands of years. The architects had been explorers and builders. They had traveled across the galaxy in vast ships, stopping at different worlds and leaving behind technology and seeds of life. They had shaped planets, creating environments suited for different types of beings. This jungle moon had been one of their experiments. Eleanor studied the data carefully, reading translations that the ship's systems provided. She pointed to sections that showed detailed information about the jungle itself. The plants and animals below were not natural. They were designed by the architects. The jungle had been meant to be perfect, a garden of life and beauty. But something had gone wrong. The experiment had evolved in unexpected ways over thousands of years. The jungle had grown wild and strange, creating a world that neither the architects nor their machines had predicted. Edward showed Eleanor something else he had found. In the ship's computer system there were messages. Old messages left by the architects before they disappeared. Eleanor's hands shook as she worked to decode them. The ship's system helped, translating ancient language into modern human speech. But the deeper Eleanor went, the more urgent and frightening the messages became. The architects had not simply vanished by accident. They had disappeared because something had forced them to leave. Something dangerous. Something that the architects had feared enough to abandon entire worlds and leave behind only machines and warnings. Eleanor and Edward worked through the night, discovering pieces of a story that grew more complex and terrifying with each discovery. The architects had encountered an ancient enemy long ago. An enemy that was not just dangerous but evil in a way that seemed almost alive. This enemy had destroyed many worlds and consumed entire civilizations. The architects had fought a great war to stop this threat. They had managed to imprison it, to lock it away in a place far from the normal space where stars and planets lived. But the architects had known that the imprisonment would not last forever. The lock would weaken over time. Millions of years might pass, but eventually the ancient enemy would escape. The architects had created fail-safes, guardians left behind on different worlds. The ship was one of them. The ship was designed to protect, to defend, to hold back the darkness if it ever returned. Eleanor sat down heavily, her mind struggling to accept what she was reading. She looked at Edward with fear in her eyes. Edward understood what she was feeling because he felt it too. They had found something so large and important that it seemed impossible. But the evidence was everywhere around them, written in the technology and the messages of a dead civilization. The most recent message was the most important. It was a final message from the last architects before they disappeared completely. The message explained something shocking. The architects had studied different species across the galaxy. They had watched how different beings thought and acted and solved problems. They had come to a conclusion that surprised them. There was a young species, newly arrived at the stars, that possessed qualities the architects respected. This species was creative and adaptable and brave. This species refused to give up even when facing impossible odds. That species was humanity. The architects had designed the failsafes with humanity in mind. They believed that humans, despite being young and inexperienced, had something special inside them. They had the strength to stand against darkness. They had the ingenuity to solve problems that seemed impossible. The activation protocol required a being with human qualities to choose to accept the responsibility of guardianship. Eleanor looked at Edward. Edward looked at Eleanor. They both understood what this meant. The ship was waiting for someone to accept a burden so heavy that it affected the entire galaxy. The ship was waiting for a human to make a choice that would change everything. Edward turned back to the central control panel. He could see the activation sequence displayed before him, waiting for someone brave enough to begin it. He thought about all the people on Earth, all the humans who had never known that their species was chosen for something so important. He placed his hand on the panel. Eleanor did not try to stop him. The ship began to wake up completely, and the future of humanity changed forever. Edward's hand trembled as it rested on the cold metal of the central control panel. Eleanor stood beside him, her breath held, her eyes fixed on the symbols that glowed beneath his fingers. Around them the ship seemed to be waiting. Even the air felt heavy with anticipation, as if the entire structure was holding its breath. The activation protocol was not like starting a computer or pressing a button. It required something much deeper and more meaningful. According to the messages left by the architects, the protocol needed a conscious choice. A willing acceptance. A being had to step forward and agree to take responsibility for protecting an entire galaxy from an ancient and terrible threat. This was not a small decision. This was not something that could be undone. Edward closed his eyes and thought about what he was about to do. He thought about his life before this moment. He had been a simple scientist studying rocks and plants on distant moons. He had been nobody important. He had no power, no authority, no reason to believe that his choices mattered to anyone but himself. But now, in this moment, he understood that one person could change everything. One choice could affect billions of lives across the entire galaxy. He pressed his hand firmly against the panel. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Knowledge flooded into Edward's mind like a river bursting through a broken dam. He saw visions that were not his own memories. He experienced moments from the lives of the architects, seeing through their eyes as they built empires and shaped worlds. He felt their fear when they discovered the ancient enemy. He understood their desperation when they realized they could not win the war alone. He experienced their hope when they began to understand that a younger species, humans, possessed qualities that might succeed where they had failed. The knowledge came so fast that Edward fell to his knees. Eleanor caught him, holding him steady, speaking his name over and over to keep him anchored to reality. The visions continued, showing him possibilities and futures and dangers that lurked in the darkness between stars. Edward saw civilizations rising and falling. He saw worlds consumed by darkness. He saw moments of triumph and moments of terrible defeat. Then the vision stopped. Edward opened his eyes and gasped for air. His entire body was shaking, but he felt different. Changed. As if something ancient and vast had recognized him and accepted him. Eleanor helped him stand, and when Edward looked at his hands, they were glowing faintly with the same blue light that filled the ship around them. Eleanor whispered, "What happened to you?" Edward could not find words to explain. He simply knew. He knew the ship's systems now. He understood the technology in ways that should have taken years to learn. He understood his responsibility. The knowledge was inside him, part of him, as natural as breathing. Edward turned to face the central chamber of the ship. He could see a massive core of energy pulsing in the distance, visible through several transparent walls. The core was what powered the entire structure. It was what kept the ancient seals strong. It was the heart of the failsafe system that the architects had created millions of years ago. Edward raised his hand, and without touching anything, the activation sequence began. The ship trembled. It was not a violent movement, but a gentle awakening. Machines that had been sleeping for thousands of years began to hum to life. Systems that had been dormant activated one by one, restoring power and function to chambers that had been dark and silent for ages. Lights blazed to life throughout the entire structure. The walls seemed to breathe as energy flowed through them like blood through veins. Eleanor grabbed Edward's arm as the floor beneath them began to move. The ship was rising. The massive structure was lifting free from the jungle floor where it had been anchored for so long. Edward rushed to the nearest window and looked out. What he saw took his breath away. The jungle below erupted in light. Every bioluminescent plant, every glowing creature, every living thing that carried light in its body suddenly shone with brilliant intensity. The entire forest blazed with synchronized light, creating a symphony of color that painted the night sky in waves of blue, purple, green, and white. The light was so bright that it seemed to turn night into day. It seemed to announce to the entire world that something ancient had awakened. The ship rose higher and higher. As it climbed into the sky, camouflage systems fell away, revealing the true form of the vessel. It was enormous. Massive weapon systems came into view, ancient defenses that had been hidden beneath layers of vegetation and time. The ship was not just a research vessel. It was a guardian. It was a fortress. It was a weapon designed to protect against threats that most species could not even imagine. Eleanor stood beside Edward, watching the jungle world transform beneath them. Tears ran down her face, but she was smiling. She understood that they were witnessing something impossible. They were witnessing history. They were witnessing the moment when humanity inherited a cosmic responsibility. The ship stabilized in the sky, hovering above the jungle like a god surveying its domain. Edward could feel the ship through his connection to it. He could sense its power, its purpose, and its ancient loneliness. This machine had waited for millions of years for someone to accept its burden. It had been alone, dreaming of the day when a worthy guardian would finally come. Now that day had arrived. Edward turned to Eleanor and took her hand. Together they moved to the observation deck, stepping into a chamber with walls of transparent crystal. From here they could see the entire jungle moon spread out below them. They could see the distant mountains and the great forest. They could see the rivers that glowed with reflected light from the jungle plants. Eleanor squeezed Edward's hand tightly. She asked the question that both of them were thinking. What happens now? Edward looked out at the galaxy beyond the atmosphere. Somewhere out there, other ships like this one were awakening. Other fail-safes, left behind by the architects on distant worlds, were sensing that one of their siblings had been activated. The message was spreading across the stars. The Guardians were waking up. Humanity had been chosen. Edward smiled, even though he knew that tremendous challenges lay ahead. He knew that humanity would face trials and dangers beyond anything they had ever experienced. But he also knew something else. He knew that humans possessed strength and courage and creativity. The architects had believed this. Now Edward believed it too. Now, Edward said softly, humanity stands guard over the galaxy. Now we fulfill our destiny among the stars. The jungle ship hung silently in the night sky, its lights glowing steady and strong, a beacon announcing that a new age had begun. The transmission came through at dawn. Edward was resting in the ship's observation chamber when the alert system activated. Symbols blazed across every surface around him, urgent and demanding attention. Eleanor was asleep in another chamber, but Edward did not wake her. He moved quickly to the communication center, his heart already racing with a sense of dread he could not explain. The message originated from deep space, far beyond any human settlement or colony. It came from another architect failsafe station, one that Edward had discovered during his studies of the ship's network. That station had also awakened when this ship activated. Now it was sending a warning. A desperate, urgent warning that made Edward's blood run cold. The sealed threat was escaping. Edward read the message several times, hoping he had misunderstood something. But the data was clear and impossible to misinterpret. The ancient enemy that the architects had imprisoned millions of years ago was breaking free from its prison. The seals that had held it contained for so long were weakening. Energy readings showed something vast and powerful moving toward the outer boundaries of known space. The ancient parasite called the Devourers was returning to the galaxy. Edward immediately sent an urgent beacon to Earth. He transmitted all the data he possessed, explaining everything he had discovered. He explained about the architects, about their war against the Devourers, about the imprisonment that was failing. He explained that humanity now possessed the technology and the responsibility to prepare for a threat that was unlike anything any modern civilization had ever faced. The response from Earth took hours to arrive. Admiral Robert Shaw, commander of the human space fleet, was confused at first. He thought Edward was joking or that something had malfunctioned in the ship's systems. Shaw demanded proof. He requested more data. He wanted technical specifications and logical explanations. Edward provided everything he could, but he knew that no amount of data would prepare Earth for the truth of what was coming. Eleanor arrived in the communication chamber while Edward was still transmitting information to Earth. She looked at his face and immediately understood that something terrible had happened. Edward told her about the Devourers and the failing seals. Eleanor's face went pale. She sat down heavily and stared at the data displays floating in the air around them. "How long?" she asked quietly. "How long before they arrive?" Edward checked the calculations provided by the architect systems. The numbers were not encouraging. "Months," he said. "Maybe less. The energy signatures are growing stronger every hour. They are moving faster than the original predictions suggested." Eleanor stood up and began pacing. She was thinking, processing the information, trying to understand the scale of what they were facing. Finally she spoke. "We need to contact other species. If the architects faced this threat and needed to create multiple failsafes, then other civilizations must have encountered these Devourers too. We need to find allies." Edward nodded. This was the logical response, but it meant reaching out to species that humanity had barely contacted. Most human settlements were still learning how to negotiate with the few alien races they had encountered. The idea of forming a united defense against a galaxy-consuming threat seemed impossible. But it was necessary. Edward and Eleanor worked through the night, sending messages across the galaxy using the architect communication networks. They reached out to every sentient civilization they could identify. The responses began arriving within hours. Some species dismissed the warnings. Some demanded more proof. But slowly, one by one, other species acknowledged the danger. They began sharing their own ancient records, their own warnings passed down from ancestors who had encountered the Devourers long ago. A pattern emerged. Every spacefaring civilization in the galaxy had stories about an ancient enemy that consumed worlds and civilizations. Every species had legends about a great war fought by ancestors to imprison this threat. The Devourers were not a myth. They were real and they were returning. Admiral Shaw finally accepted the truth. He called for an emergency session of the human government. Within days, Edward received a message saying that humanity was mobilizing. Military fleets were being prepared. Scientists were being assembled to study the architect technology. Edward was appointed as the primary liaison between humanity and the ancient systems that he had awakened. But the skepticism on Earth was strong. Some politicians argued that the threat was exaggerated. Some military commanders wanted to ignore the warnings and focus on human expansion instead. Some scientists claimed that the data was unreliable or that Edward had misinterpreted what he had found. The doubters and the fearful slowed humanity's preparations. Then something happened that made the threat impossible to deny. One of the distant architect failsafe stations went silent. It simply stopped transmitting. Investigation revealed that it had been destroyed. Something vast had reached it and torn it apart. The energy signatures showed the same pattern as the Devourers. The ancient enemy was real, it was powerful, and it was coming. Fear swept through human civilization. The doubters became believers. The skeptics became desperate. Admiral Shaw accelerated the mobilization efforts. Military fleets began moving into defensive positions. Scientists worked around the clock to understand the architect technology. Edward received contact from other species. Civilizations that had been distant and neutral suddenly wanted to form alliances. Species that had been enemies began talking about cooperation. The threat of the Devourers was so enormous that it transcended all other disagreements. Every intelligent being in the galaxy understood that they faced extinction if they did not stand together. Eleanor worked with Edward to prepare the jungle ship for battle. She studied the weapons systems, understanding how ancient technology could be combined with modern human innovation. She realized that neither the old technology alone nor human weapons alone would be sufficient. They needed to work together, combining ancient knowledge with new thinking. Weeks passed and humanity prepared for war. Fleet commanders trained their crews. Scientists learned to work with architect systems. Alliances were formed between species that had never cooperated before. A vast defense network began to take shape, connecting worlds and fleets and stations across the galaxy. Edward stood on the bridge of the jungle ship with Eleanor beside him. They watched as smaller vessels approached from human space. Ships carrying soldiers and scientists and commanders who would help defend against the ancient threat. Ships carrying the hope of an entire species. Eleanor spoke softly. "Are we ready?" Edward was honest. "No," he said. "We will never be ready for this. But we have to try anyway." The ships approached, and Edward understood that the real battle was about to begin. Humanity and their new allies would face the Devourers. The fate of the entire galaxy would depend on their courage and their willingness to fight against impossible odds. The ancient threat was coming, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The final battle began at dawn, though dawn meant nothing in the emptiness of space. Edward stood on the bridge of the jungle ship, surrounded by screens showing the positions of thousands of vessels. Human warships flew alongside alien craft. Species that had been enemies for generations now fought together against a common threat. The coordination was imperfect, but it was real. It was enough. Beside Edward stood Admiral Robert Shaw, a man whose face had aged 10 years in the past few weeks. Eleanor worked at a tactical station, her brilliant mind calculating trajectories and defensive positions. Around them, crew members monitored systems and weapons, preparing for a battle that would determine whether civilization would survive or whether the Devourers would consume everything. The enemy emerged from the darkness like a plague of locusts devouring a field. Ships that seemed to consume light itself approached the defensive lines. These were not vessels built by rational beings following logical design principles. These were organic structures, living weapons that shifted and changed and adapted to every attack. The Devourers were not just dangerous. They were something that violated the natural order of the universe itself. The first wave of attacks began. Human weapons fired at the approaching ships. Alien energy weapons joined the assault. For a moment it seemed like the defense might work. Several Devourer vessels were damaged or destroyed. But then the enemy responded, and hope died in the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. The Devourers did not fight like normal ships. They consumed what they attacked. Energy weapons that struck them were absorbed and converted into more power for the Devourers. Conventional attacks seemed to make them stronger, not weaker. Ships that came too close were engulfed in darkness and dragged into the void, their crews screaming as they were consumed. Admiral Shaw watched the horror unfolding on his screens. He looked at Edward and asked the question that everyone was thinking. Can we win this? Edward did not answer immediately. He felt the presence of the jungle ship around him, the vast intelligence of the architect system connected to his mind. The ship showed him possibilities and strategies that human minds had not conceived. It showed him the nature of the Devourers, patterns in their behavior that could be exploited. It showed him something else too. A way to strengthen the ancient seals. A way to imprison the Devourers again, but only if someone was willing to sacrifice everything. Edward looked at Eleanor. She was already staring at him, and he realized that she had reached the same conclusion. She knew what had to be done. She knew the price that would be paid. Tears were running down her face, but she nodded slowly, accepting what was necessary. We can win, Edward said to Admiral Shaw. But we need to do something dangerous. We need to reach the source of their power. Edward explained the plan. Deep within the approaching Devourer armada was a central vessel, a command ship from which the others were controlled. If that ship could be destroyed or disabled, the rest of the Devourers would scatter and lose coordination. But reaching it would be almost impossible. They would need to fly directly through the center of the enemy forces. It would be a suicide mission. Admiral Shaw listened, and when Edward finished, Shaw smiled sadly. I have been a soldier for 40 years, Shaw said. I have given orders that sent good people to die. This is the first time I will volunteer to die myself. Shaw organized a strike force of the bravest and most skilled pilots from every species in the Alliance. Humans, aliens with scales and tentacles and wings, all of them understood what they were volunteering for. They understood they might not come back. They prepared their ships and their weapons, and they moved toward the center of the enemy formation. The Devourers attacked furiously, trying to stop the strike force from reaching their command ship. Explosions bloomed in the darkness of space like terrible flowers. Ships were destroyed. Pilots died. But the strike force kept moving forward, advancing through overwhelming fire toward their objective. Eleanor coordinated the assault from the jungle ship. She used architect technology to create defensive barriers and to disrupt the Devourers' communication systems. She gave commands that seemed to violate all military logic, but they worked. She found patterns in the chaos and exploited them with ruthless precision. The strike force reached the command ship and attacked it with everything they possessed. Energy weapons carved into its hull. Missiles detonated against its surface. For a moment, it seemed like they might actually destroy it. But then the command ship responded, and 3 of the 4 lead ships in the strike force were consumed by waves of darkness. Admiral Shaw piloted the surviving lead ship. He was one of the last humans still alive in the assault group. He looked at his remaining pilots and made a choice. He activated the self-destruct sequence on his vessel and rammed it directly into the heart of the Devourer command ship. The explosion was massive. The command ship shattered, breaking apart into fragments of dying metal and living darkness. The remaining Devourer vessels suddenly lost coordination. They began attacking each other. They began retreating into the void. Victory seemed possible. Edward felt the moment approaching. He could sense it through his connection to the Architect systems. The seals that imprisoned the Devourers were failing completely. They would break in minutes. But there was a way to reinforce them. A way to make them strong again. But it required someone to go into the space between realities, to touch the seals directly from the other side. It required someone to sacrifice themselves. Eleanor understood what Edward was thinking. She stood up from her station and walked toward him. She took his hands and looked into his eyes. "I will do it," she said. "I will go. I will save the galaxy." Edward wanted to argue. He wanted to find another way. But there was no other way. He held Eleanor close, and she moved toward the chamber where the ancient portal waited. The jungle ship opened a doorway to a place that no living human was meant to visit. Eleanor stepped through and the door closed behind her. For a long moment nothing happened. Then, across the entire galaxy, a shockwave of energy spread outward. The ancient seals, reinforced by Eleanor's sacrifice, blazed with renewed strength. The Devourers screamed, a sound that echoed across dimensions, and retreated further into their prison. The seals locked into place, stronger than they had ever been. The remaining Devourer ships began to collapse and fade, pulled back toward their imprisoned realm. The battle was over. Humanity and their allies had won. But the victory was hollow. Eleanor was gone. She had given everything to save the galaxy. Edward stood alone on the bridge of the jungle ship, looking out at the stars. In the distance he could see ships from 100 different species, damaged and scarred from battle but still alive. Billions of beings across the galaxy had survived because of Eleanor's choice. Because of human courage. Slowly, other species began reaching out. They contacted Edward with messages of gratitude and respect. They acknowledged that humanity, though young and inexperienced, had proven themselves worthy of standing among the stars. Humans had shown courage and ingenuity and sacrifice. Humans had earned their place in the galaxy. The jungle ship descended toward the moon below, its lights glowing steady and strong. Edward looked at the bioluminescent jungle and thought about Eleanor. He thought about how one person's willingness to sacrifice had changed the fate of an entire galaxy. Humanity had ascended. They had become guardians of the stars. And they had done it through courage, through determination, and through the belief that one being could make a difference in a vast and infinite universe. The jungle ship landed silently in the jungle below, its work complete, its promise fulfilled. The age of humanity among the stars had truly begun.